All right. So, my name's Jesse DeGuano. I'm with Blackwing Intelligence. We do security junk. I hack all sorts of things, have for quite a long time. I've been playing with OS X, though, for a while, especially on the kernel side. I've done a bit of work and research in OS X rootkits, kernel rootkits. I presented at Black Hat back in 2008 on OS X kernel rootkits. And then here, a couple years ago, some of the same techniques, talking about manipulating the kernel and hiding traces, things like that, but from within shellcode, so to prevent having to write kex modules to disk and things like that. So first, we'll just take a couple minutes, especially as people filter in, and talk about why hack Macs, or why I hack Macs, along with other things. The first computer that I ever got to play with was an Apple IIe back in elementary school, and I was introduced to Logo Writer. Any Logo Writer aficionados? Awesome. Then in about third grade, they got Macintosh, and we got Oregon Trail. But we were required to do some sort of typing program before we got to play Oregon Trail, so learned how to hack Macs kind of early. So they hold kind of a special place in my heart, Macs. Also, especially back when I started looking at Mac stuff quite a few years ago, there was a much smaller group of researchers that were really focusing on OS X. There still is a much smaller group than many other platforms that focus on OS X. This was before iOS, though, which has kind of expanded that group. So it was much easier to find kind of more interesting bugs, more interesting things to explore that others hadn't done, and of course, become famous. As you can see, I'm winning that way because I've got 65 followers. So. Finally, a couple other reasons to be interested in attacking Macs. Who doesn't want to own hipsters at Starbucks? And also most people at security conferences. So hipsters. And pretty much everybody at security conferences, right? So I have to take a few minutes to kind of go over some of the background of XNU, the Unix kernel, if you're not familiar with it. If you are familiar with kernel programming on Mac, then you'll already be familiar with a lot of this story. So once upon a time, at UC Berkeley, back? Cool. All right, so we're probably mostly familiar with BSD. Back in the day, UC Berkeley came out with an operating system called BSD. It's a Unix operating system, had a monolithic kernel. Meanwhile, overlapping times, Carnegie Mellon came up with the idea to create a microkernel called Mach. And that's actually the official Mach logo, as you can see. Then there was this guy named Steve. And he got fired. And so he started his own company, another company called Next, and introduced BSD to Mach. But then the company he got fired from was failing, so they brought him back. And so he married BSD and Mach, and we get Darwin. So XNU is the kernel, the Darwin kernel. there's two primary portions because of this kind of weird marriage between BSD and Mach. BSD, like I said, is a monolithic kernel, so all the kernel services run within kernel space. Mach was supposed to be a microkernel, so most services ran actually in user space with only the lowest level operations being in the kernel, in kernel space. So when you put them together, you get the BSD portion in the XNU kernel, which handles things like it has the POSIX API, which actually a lot of the POSIX API are really wrappers around Mach calls at the lower level. You have Unix processes, which we're probably all familiar with, networking, file system stuff, all that kind of thing. And then on the Mach side of the kernel, you have a lot of the lower level operations. You have hardware I/O, memory management's done in Mach, and you have this construct of Mach tasks. And actually, when you look at processes in OS X, or Unix processes, they're actually built on top of Mach tasks without you necessarily knowing it. There's also IPC, which is kind of a fundamental part of the Mach kernel, especially as a microkernel, because it was very communication-centric. So this is a kind of a picture of some of the services that and where they fall in the portions of the XNU kernel. So again, you have processes, BSD processes, file systems, crypto stuff, networking, POSIX API, and the BSD side. And then at the lower level, you have kernel threads and interrupts and the hardware interface and IPC and memory management and Mach tasks and things like that that are all at in the Mach layer of the XNU kernel. So we're going to talk about attacking XNU or some approaches to finding bugs in the XNU kernel. So why attack the kernel? Most kernel vulns aren't really reachable, just directly remotely reachable, unless it's a portion of the kernel that's actually processing externally or attacker-controlled data, right? So possibly vulnerabilities in network drivers or protocol handlers, things like that, may be remotely exploitable. Kernel vulns are definitely useful for local exploitation, though, right? If we have unprivileged access to a box, then escalating our privileges to that of root, executing code in ring 0 is beneficial for that privilege escalation. But shifting away from kind of just direct remote code execution from a client to server perspective or attacker to server perspective, as we know, most modern attackers have really shifted a lot of focus toward client-side attacks, right? Client-side exploitation, exploiting browsers, document handlers, things like that. Especially when you're talking about attacking OSs that are primarily being used as client-side devices, like Macs. So to combat this trend, a lot of vendors have started to adopt the use of sandboxes, right? Compartmentalizing processes so that even if a process gets owned, that it limits the impact, so somebody can't just directly own the box from a compromised process or own other compromised processes, even running at the same privilege level. So you pwn the app and you're still stuck playing in that sandbox. So there's lots of browsers that do that, and we're also probably familiar with that concept on most mobile devices, right? iOS, for instance, has sandboxing so that applications that have vulnerabilities don't put other applications, theoretically, at risk, or the entire system at risk if the application gets popped. So nowadays, with these types of applications or devices or environments, in order to get privileged access to a host, then we need to chain together, usually, multiple vulnerabilities in order to, once not only exploiting a vulnerability in an application, but then chain multiple vulnerabilities in order to actually get to our goal and escape the sandbox and get privileged access to whatever our target is. a lot of times the easiest way to escape a sandbox is to find and exploit a kernel vulnerability. So we might trigger and exploit some application vulnerability and whatever other prerequisites are involved in actually popping the application itself, whether it's an info leak and things like that in order to get by mitigation controls. But then we're playing in that sandbox of the app. So then we might have to chain together other vulnerabilities to bypass other mitigations. And finally, potentially, if we land a kernel vulnerability or exploit a kernel vulnerability, we can escape that sandbox and elevate our privileges. Most iOS jailbreaks use kernel vulnerabilities in the untethering portion of the jailbreak in order to bypass that sandbox. So what kind of kernel vulnerabilities, where can we look for kernel vulnerabilities? Well, with a traditional kernel, the attack surface often looks something like this, give or take. So a lot of from a user's perspective, we have an attack surface of different device drivers, either in-house or third-party device drivers that have been installed and potentially vulnerabilities that exist in them. Networking stacks, networking drivers. File systems may have bugs that can be exploited. And system calls, which are a direct interface from user land to kernel land, right? That can be called, and if there's a vulnerability in the system call handler, that might be able to be exploited as well. So just like BSD, OS X also supports most of your common POSIX syscalls via the BSD subsystem. So if we look at syscall.h, we can see a list of syscalls, and if we're familiar with Unix programming, then we're familiar with the system calls, things like exit, fork, read, the general Unix syscalls. Of course, looking for bugs in syscall handlers is not new. It's really one of the most straightforward interfaces, again, between the user land and the kernel, and can be directly called. So, got an alignment issue there. But let's see. There's system call fuzzers that have existed for quite a while, and are purpose-built for fuzzing syscalls on different operating systems. Like Linux, for instance, there's the syscall fuzzer Trinity, which you might have used or might be familiar with, which is even today still finding bugs in Linux system calls. Just last month, there was a Linux kernel bug in the perf event syscall that was dropped, and it was originally found from fuzzing with Trinity. So in addition to the BSD syscalls, though, there's also the mock side. And mock actually has system calls as well, or mock traps, as they're called. And so if you look at the kernel source, you can see a list of the mock traps. You can see, actually, this is all of the mock traps listed here. And in order to call these mock traps, you put the trap number multiplied by -1, so a negative index into the table, into a register, and call it. But there's much fewer, as you can see, mock syscalls or mock traps than there would be on the BSD side, as far as from a fuzzing or vulnerability discovery perspective. Kind of a much smaller number. But as we look through them, we see some interesting, a few interesting system calls. We'll just highlight two of them right now. Mock message trap and mock message overwrite trap. So if we look at mock message, the man page for mock message, what it actually does is it's a system trap or function that the purpose is to send mock messages, send and receive mock messages to mock ports. Now this is actually a pretty fundamental part of mock. This, again, it's a communication-based kernel. So sending mock messages is a key portion of the activity within the mock kernel. So we have this concept now of an IPC mechanism within the mock subsystem, sending mock messages between tasks. So in order to delve into that, we need a quick intro then to mock. So mock has, like I said, tasks. There's this concept of tasks. And each task, each mock task, is a kind of a bundle of resources that has an address space, ports namespace, and mock threads. And each and within mock threads are different from like Unix threads. But you have a minimum of one task and one thread per process. The concept of POSIX processes, or PIDs, on our OS X box are built on top of this concept of mock tasks. So every BSD process, when you run PS on Mac, has a corresponding Mac task. So we have a picture of a process. There's a BSD process. So we have one or multiple mock threads associated with that process, with that task. We have a process structure, a BSD process structure. And then we have virtual memory space, ports, a port namespace, which has port rights and ports, which we'll get into a little bit more. So ports are associated with mock tasks. Mock tasks, this is how mock tasks interact with each other using that IPC mechanism. The ports are a unidirectional communication mechanism between one task and another task that wants to communicate in some way. And port rights, each task can allocate to other task port rights in order to be able to communicate with their task ports. So we have two mock tasks talking with each other, sending mock messages between ports. And within those messages, we have a variety of pieces of information. We have port rights that can be passed via ports. We have data, commands, all sorts of different pieces of information that can be passed via this IPC mechanism. This slide was supposed to be first. So any mock task can open up ports for communication and can then request access from another task in order to use that task's ports. If you're developing an application and you want to make direct use of mock tasks, you usually use MIG, or the mock interface generator, which actually what it does is you specify prototypes for your ports and in a defs file, and you use a MIG utility. And by using, when you use MIG, it actually generates all the plumbing code for the IPC mechanism. So then all you have to do as a developer is develop the actual handlers on each side of the IPC ports. So in order to talk with another task, there's a variety of mechanisms, but we need to get a port right. We need to get access to speak to that task's port. So one way of doing that is by utilizing another mock trap called task for PID. Task for PID then returns a port right if you have access to it to speak with or to communicate with another task's port. So the kernel then provides interfaces for tasks to manipulate other tasks. These are actually IPC interfaces that can be talked to and allow you to request certain things of other tasks. Request the kernel to do certain things to another task. So based on the port right that you also pass it. So there are C wrappers around these calls. For instance, you can ask the kernel to allocate memory or deallocate memory in another task, assuming you have the permissions and the right to do so if you own that task and you have the correct permissions. So there's an API, a C API, VM allocate and VM deallocate, in order to allow you to manipulate other tasks. memory space and do a variety of other things. This particular functionality is really useful if you were writing a rootkit, for instance, because then you can manipulate another task and either inject code, inject threads, hide processes, things like that, hide activities, hide code. And even more so, the kernel is also just another task. So if you were to create, call task for PID and have access to task for PID on the PID 0, then you could obtain rights to the kernel task and manipulate the actual kernel. And this is really useful for kernel manipulation, kernel rootkits. Unfortunately, obviously, because of, the danger of this, with Snow Leopard, anybody calling task for PID, even root calling task for PID with a PID of 0 is blocked. So we can't do that anymore in order to, from userland, directly manipulate the kernel. But let's take a look for a minute and actually kind of drill down into VM allocate, that function, in order to allocate memory in another task. If we look in the XNU source, osfmk VM map user.c, which was generated from a defs file with Meg, we look at the actual function here. First of all, there's VM allocate. It takes a task, an address, a size to allocate, and flags. But if we look further down, we have a few declarations and filling out header information. And eventually, what it's actually doing is it's sending a mock message. So this wrapper to call that API, VM allocate, is actually just setting up the appropriate arguments in order to send a mock message to the appropriate task port. So the kernel exposes these interfaces via mock IPC. And there's quite a few interfaces available. So as we look through kernel source and the source generated from MIG, then we see different message IDs, like this is 3801 for VM allocate. And we see down in the code where that is actually that's being set in the mock message header before the mock message actually sent. So if we just grep the source for what RPC interfaces are available, we see that there's 237 mock IPC interfaces that are exposed in addition to other ways of communicating to the kernel. So if we go back to what our kernel attack surface might look like, theoretically, we have, again, device drivers, networking, file systems, system calls, but then we also, in addition, have mock IPC servers. All these IPC services that are listening and can be talked to, you can talk to the kernel, and we have 237 of them in order to potentially find bugs in. So that's what we're going to talk about, is how we might kind of brute force finding bug hunting within the mock IPC interfaces via fuzzing. So this talk, I'm not going to be disclosing vulnerabilities that were found in this process. It won't be an O-Day yard sale or garage sale. I think it's really important to cherish and care for bugs that we find, as opposed to letting them go. So, we'll start with the first approach that I took when kind of fuzzing the IPC interfaces here. Dumb fuzzing. Can everybody read it? Give everybody a minute. All right. Who got it? All right. So to start with, we'll talk about what the basic structure of a mock message when talking with the kernel. We have a request message here, this structure. We'll start with the mock message header. defines a bunch of things about the message we're going to send, like the message ID, the corresponding ID to that RPC interface within the kernel that we want to talk to. The size of the message, the ports, the reply port to come to, what port we're actually wanting to talk to, etc. Then there's an NDR record, which I have no idea what it is, but it needs to be there for padding, so we'll ignore that. And then we have the body of the message. So this is, at a very high level, just abstract of what a mock message always, looks like. There's a header and a body, depending on the type of message that we're trying to send. So for just dumb fuzzing, step one was allocate some memory. So basically, in a loop, obviously, just kind of arbitrarily allocate some memory, paint it with some data, fill in the mock message header so that we have the appropriate, we're with the message ID we're targeting and the size we want to target and all of the rest of that information. So that's intact. So this is interesting. So we need to define what remote port that we want to talk to when we're sending a mock message. We're sending it actually to a remote task, right? But the kernel is going to interpret what interface we want to talk to based on the message ID and do something. So then we're executing or potentially, interacting with the kernel. But we need to talk to, we need a valid port that we have a port right to. And port rights are kind of reduced as far as what ports you can talk to as a task, unless you're a privileged user. Talking to or calling task for PID on a variety of different processes is pretty restricted. But we can talk to our own task port. So we always have a port right to talk to our own task port. So we can just get that with mock task self. And we're still crossing the kernel boundary because of the message ID that we're targeting. But we always have that port right. So then we send a message. So we've then we repeat, right? So we increment the size that we're sending, loop to whatever maximum size, and then increment the message ID that we want to send, and until we've gone through all the available message IDs. So it looks something like this. Pretty dumb. Basically, define a message ID, malloc some memory, fill that memory with something random, fill in so that we have an appropriate header, and then send the mock message. And then increment the size until we've gone through our available the sizes we want to test, and then loop through and increment to the next message ID. So that's a pretty dumb approach, right? The easiest, lowest barrier for entry to fuzz an IPC interface. So I'm putting this together. I'm thinking, it's 2013. There's not going to be kernel bugs found with that first step, right? But no, with that, you still get crashes. So I decided to take a little bit less of a dumb approach. And instead of basically just kind of allocating some random piece of memory and kind of painting it with something random, allocate some memory, fill it with specific values, iterating over all the possible values, fill in the message header, and then go through and iterate through that, modifying that body, so flipping bits and things like that, and sending messages to see if maybe we get a little bit more coverage. Of course, the same thing. Increasing the message size that we send, then incrementing the message ID so that we cover all the available message IDs. So some pseudocode for that pseudocode. And bugs again, but they're the same bugs. So next approach is mutation fuzzing. We're probably all familiar with the concept of mutation fuzzing. The idea is you take good input that you've observed or you can see working with whatever your target is, like a file or network packet or protocol traffic, something that you know is working. You mutate that input by doing a variety of different mutations, whether it's bit flipping or byte swapping or injecting odd values in different known places throughout the at different offsets throughout the body. You send, you loop, and see if you find anything. So an example of mutation fuzzing on file fuzzing is file format fuzzing. You collect good document files like PDFs or docs, things like that. Iterate over the contents of the file, modify different values by a variety of means, execute the app with every iteration and see if it crashes, and you detect to see if it crashes. And if you get it to crash, then you have to do triage, and hopefully you profit with a vuln. Network mutation fuzzing is kind of is similar. We sniff normal traffic between a client and a server. We take that traffic, we mutate different parts of it, we replay it to the server, and again, hopefully it crashes. So again, if we look back at the idea of mock messages and this message passing between mock and this IPC interface, then it looks it's similar to network traffic. So what we need here is some sort of a sniffer between mock messages in order to get good messages and try to do mutation fuzzing. So if we look at the kernel source, we look at mock message, the actual code for the mock message trap, it's a pretty short function. We see it's actually here filling in receive message with 0, and then calling mock message overwrite trap. So that's the actual call that's getting called. So there's the mock trap table. And this is the table where all the mock traps are indexed in order to be called. So if we look again at kernel source in syscall sw.c, or that might be a header file, we see a list. We see the mock trap table where it's defined, and we see a list of all the mock traps that we talked about earlier. So if we're looking to target mock message overwrite trap, then we look at that. We see it's the 33rd index, right, into the mock trap table. So in GDB, if we open up GDB on the mock kernel, and we print out mock trap table with an index of 32, we see this is the structure of that table. We have mock trap arg count, how many arguments are going to be expected for that particular mock trap callback, and then the mock trap function itself. So we see that in this table, we have the number of arguments that are expected and a function pointer for the handler for that particular trap. So it looks something like this. We have the mock trap table, and within at the 32nd index here, we have mock message overwrite trap, which actually has a function pointer to the function handler. The trap handler. So it seems logical to try to hook that. So the approach is create a kext to to install into the kernel. We find the mock trap table, mock trap function for mock message overwrite trap, and save it off. We overwrite our mock trap table, the mock trap function address with an address of a function that we've created, which then actually calls mock message overwrite trap. And we've successfully hooked. So the mock trap table, we change the address to the address of our function, which actually points to the mock message overwrite trap hooked. We take in the arguments, we do whatever stuff we want, and we return the original mock message overwrite trap, a pretty simple hook. Unfortunately, the mock trap table and many other things are not exported in the Apple kernel programming interface. And Apple really doesn't like people trying to resolve hidden symbols. As you can see, you probably can't see this particular email, but this wasn't me writing to the Apple list. I just thought it was comical. As a developer, just asking how they might be able to resolve unknown symbols within the I/O kit. And the Apple developer support basically said you wouldn't ever want to do that unless you were doing something unscrupulous. But we wouldn't be doing anything unscrupulous, right? So obviously there's a variety of ways of resolving unresolved kernel symbols. They're actually in kernel memory, so we could walk kernel memory and resolve the symbols that we want to find out where the kernels live. The symbols live that point to what the symbol that we want. We could also have a userland process parse the kernel image for the pointer to the symbol that we want and pass it back via IPC to our text in kernel land. But I'm lazy, and I just wanted to get this thing to work. I'm not writing a rootkit. If I were writing a rootkit that had to work on multiple machines, I'd care more. But in this case, I just wanted to actually hook and get some mock messages so that I could then do some mutation fuzzing. So I took this approach, looked at what the address in the kernel was for mock trap table, and hard-coded it. So if you do this, of course, you also have to either resolve what the kernel slide is for the kernel address space layout randomization, which is pretty easy, or just disable KASLR, which is basically just a boot argument, just setting slide to 0 and then rebooting, and now KASLR is gone, so that you can actually what addresses you're going to. So we now have mock message overwrite hooked. Now we need to copy out the mock message in order to actually do something with it and do our mutations. So there's a few. If we look again in the source mock message overwrite trap source, there's IPC kmessage get and IPC kmessage copy in and a bunch of other things that are dependencies. Again, of course, not in the KPI. So I just hard-coded those two and called them. Again, that needs to be cleaned up, but it works. The other thing about doing things like this in the XNU kernel is Apple likes to be sneaky, and they provide in the header files different structures and different headers than the actual kernel uses, of course, for your text development. So often you have to rip header information or the actual full structures when you're actually wanting to manipulate the kernel from kernel source and include them directly in your project. So we have a plan. We're going to sniff mock messages, hook mock message overwrite, copy out mock message, pass it to a userland process, write it to file, and then once we've done a bunch of those, which you get a lot of those quite easily, I forgot, I was going to include a screenshot just of how many, but you get many of the calls, again, because a lot of POSIX calls are built on top of mock. Mock messages are sent all the time. And so by hooking this, you get a lot of messages quite quickly. And then fuzz. So then at a separate time, even on a different machine, you can read the file, restore mock message header to what for a new request to whatever the arguments you want, mutate the body of the message, like bit flipping, things like that, send the message, and loop and loop. Okay, so seems like I'm missing something here, but dumb and mutation fuzzing are obviously of limited value. If you're simply doing really dumb fuzzing or mutation fuzzing, you're not going to get very good depth as far as code coverage, because usually early checks will prevent your message from getting to a potentially vulnerable region of code. So in order to overcome that, intelligent fuzzing is it's more work up front, but you get more code coverage. So with intelligent fuzzing, we're probably familiar with the concept. Basically, we actually have to look at what our target is. So we look at all of these interfaces, the mock interfaces. What is going to be expected of them, what the structure of the mock message is, construct a fuzz input based on the expected data types and all of the expected body, so we can get as good a depth as possible and better coverage. And so for this, once we've actually digested what our mock messages look like, purpose-built fuzzer, or general-purpose fuzzers are pretty well suited for this kind of a task. Things like Peach or Sully or even Spike, you could do by creating a binary blob based on the structure of a mock message, and then just wrap it with sending a mock message. It's time-consuming, though, obviously. Manually creating fuzzing templates for each mock interface, because each mock interface changes what the body is going to look like, what are the expected inputs, and things like that. So there's 237 interfaces, which could take quite a while in order to do manually. So on that front, what I'm kind of looking at as far as automating that process is automating fuzz template creation of mock messages by one approach that I've been playing with is using Doxygen to document the code for the structure for each expected mock message into their XML version or report, and then extracting that information and automatically building fuzz templates based on that. Another idea that I am probably going to play with is just simply modifying MIG to, instead of just outputting the plumbing code, also output potential fuzz templates or templates that can be used with fuzzers in order to do more in-depth intelligent fuzzing. So I want to basically continue to manually create fuzzing templates from a future work perspective of this. Again, looking at possibly what in the MIG utility could be modified in order to leverage it to automatically create fuzz templates. And then also all of the other stuff that we talked about, especially the sniffer and fuzz template creation, actually cleaning up that code and releasing it so others can play with fuzzing mock messages. So you can watch our website, blackwinghq.com, or follow me on Twitter, and I'll announce that when it'll be released soon. Another thing about fuzzing, though, in general, which kind of goes without saying, but obviously fuzzing is of limited value in itself. Fuzzing's good at finding low-hanging fruit. Things like when fuzzing like the OS X kernel, you find quite a few null derefs, for instance, which can't really be exploited on OS X. Some memory corruptions, things like that. The obvious and low-hanging kind of fruit, but it doesn't replace auditing, whether it's binary auditing or source auditing of whatever your target is, because you can find much more complex bugs. Things like info leaks obviously can't be identified usually with fuzzing because it doesn't create a crash unless it's a more all-purpose bug. So that's what I got. Any questions?